Some people have spent decades pursuing the true story of JFK's life and its shocking end. With all the latest info, he has every little detail that we know.
John F. Kennedy is often remembered as one of the most popular American presidents of all time, but his life was cut all too short when he was assassinated in 1963. We've learned a lot about JFK in the decades since his death. Here's how it all changes the historical narrative. On January 20th, 1961, Kennedy kicked off his presidency with a masterful speech. His inaugural address possessed a powerful balance of hope and foreboding, as it issued warnings to America's potential enemies and urged allies across the globe to band together against the common enemies of man. Then came a quote for the ages.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Kennedy saw greatness on the horizon, and he needed his fellow Americans to join him. But it turns out that the iconic quote might have been inspired by an important figure from JFK's past. A notebook was discovered in 2011 that belonged to George St. John, former headmaster of the Choate School in Connecticut. A teenage JFK sat through St. John's sermons, and the headmaster's notes included this familiar-sounding quote from Harvard Dean LeBaron Briggs. The youth who loves his alma mater will always ask, not what can she do for me, but what can I do for her? Even before Briggs's quote came to light, historian Thurston Clark pointed out in a 2004 book about Kennedy's inauguration that St. John was known to say, "It's not what Choate does for you, but what you can do for Choate." Inga Arvid was a journalist and beauty queen in her native Denmark, but to JFK she was Inga Binga, and he was her Boston Bean. According to Kennedy scholar Nigel Hamilton, Arvid was the great love of Kennedy's life. When Arvid first met the future president in 1941, she was married to one of the world's richest men. 4 years older than Kennedy, Arvid acted as a sort of mentor. She critiqued his writing, dispensed political advice, and gave very hands-on lessons about the birds and the bees. Unfortunately, Adolf Hitler also enjoyed knowing her. Arvid had interviewed Hitler, who called her, quote, a perfect example of Nordic beauty. She was extremely chummy with the German Führer, and her husband may have been a Nazi agent. Suspecting that Arvid was a spy, FBI agents kept a close watch on her. They even eavesdropped on her pillow talk with JFK. Kennedy's father understandably didn't want him sleeping with a possible enemy, so he put a stop to the romance. For decades, Americans have perceived the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was dramatized in the 2000 film 13 Days, as a game of apocalyptic chicken that started when an unprovoked Soviet Union placed nuclear weapons in Cuba. Luckily, JFK had the fortitude and prudence needed to prevent an apocalyptic calamity. He made the Soviets back down with nary a concession by America.
That a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
But it turns out that that entire narrative is rather misleading. Since 1997, scholars have had access to recordings that Kennedy secretly made of meetings with his top advisors, and they've been trying to set the record straight since then. The truth is that JFK inflamed the Cold War by placing missiles in Turkey and Italy, uncomfortably close to the Soviets. American plots to take out Cuban leader Fidel Castro further stoked hostilities. The communists responded with ominous posturing, but Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev knew that the U.S. had a much larger arsenal. And even though Kennedy spread the lie that the U.S. forced the Soviets to unilaterally remove their missiles, JFK withdrew American missiles as well. However, he threatened to scrap the arrangement if the Soviets disclosed that fact. People often associate JFK with vim and vigor, but they probably don't think of another V word, vomiting. That's one of the many symptoms associated with an adrenal disorder called Addison's disease. That was one of the multiple ailments that Kennedy grappled with throughout his life while projecting an image of physical robustness to the public.
He was so ill that his father had put cortisone treatments in safe deposit boxes around the country if he ever needed them because of his Addison's disease.
Kennedy spent much of his presidency in physical misery due to severe back trouble and Addison's, which in addition to the vomiting causes infections, fatigue, joint and muscle pain, depression, skin discoloration, and various abdominal problems. With the help of his family, JFK mostly hid his ailing health. However, political rivals caught wind of his condition and tried to expose him. During the 1960 presidential race, Democratic hopeful and JFK's future running mate Lyndon B. Johnson told the press via his aides that JFK had Addison's disease, but the revelation was dismissed as a smear. Also, during that year's general election, Richard Nixon supposedly orchestrated a Watergate-style break-in to obtain JFK's medical records, though he failed. Well before Kennedy became president, the United States had become involved in the Vietnam War. But it wasn't until the Gulf of Tonkin incident of 1964 that America opted to wage a full-tilt military campaign against North Vietnam. Had Kennedy still been president then, that escalation may never have happened. Pentagon documents that became declassified in 1997 revealed that in October 1963, JFK ordered the withdrawal of 1,000 military personnel from Vietnam by the end of the year. Publicly, Kennedy called withdrawal, quote, a deep mistake. But behind closed doors, he rejected the Joint Chiefs of Staff's advice to take overt action and instead instructed them to take decidedly less action by leaving. Roughly a month after JFK's withdrawal order, the South Vietnamese president, who had fallen out of favor with the U.S. military, was assassinated. JFK was killed 3 weeks later, and when Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency, he bolstered both military and CIA operations almost immediately. Experts disagree on whether Kennedy would have followed through with the exit plan, but according to Johnson's former deputy national security advisor, Kennedy planned to have most U.S. forces out of Vietnam by the end of 1965. In 2025, President Donald Trump issued an executive order triggering the public release of any and all still classified government documents relating to its investigation of JFK's assassination.
That's a big one, huh? A lot of people are waiting for this for years.
The materials finally surfaced on March 18, 2025, and while they don't contain much information not previously known to the public, a few of them shed some light on Lee Harvey Oswald's history with the Soviet Union. While it's common knowledge that Oswald spent time in the USSR prior to the murder of President Kennedy, there have long been rumors that he was somehow affiliated with the KGB. One document puts that idea to rest, however. Dated November 20, 1991, the communique reveals that a KGB agent identified as Slava Nikonov went through 5 extensive files to see if Oswald had ever worked for the secretive agency, then discussed his findings with the American college professor E.B. Smith. Nikonov believed that Oswald wasn't easily manipulated, which was a prerequisite characteristic for potential KGB agents at the time. And while he was rigorously observed by Soviet agents, they believe he offered no value to the agency. At one point, for example, they saw him doing target practice and deemed his shooting skills subpar. According to the Warren Commission, Oswald was the sole person responsible for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963. Oswald took up a position in Dallas's Texas School Book Depository building. At around 12:30 p.m., the former U.S. Marine fired 3 shots at the president's passing motorcade. It was the third and final shot that struck Kennedy in the head, ultimately killing him. But the second bullet from Oswald's rifle also did a substantial amount of damage, as it tore through both the president and his riding companion, Texas Governor John Connally.
When I felt an impact, as if someone hit me with a closed fist.
The bullet entered Kennedy through his back and then exited through the neck. It continued to travel, striking Connally near his armpit, then moved through the governor's chest and body, injuring his wrist before stopping in his thigh.
Couldn't be a more horrible experience.
Since 1960, Secret Service agent Clint Hill had been assigned to First Lady Jackie Kennedy's security team. He was present on the Dallas trip in November 1963, and after hearing the first shot, he literally jumped into action, mounting the back of the car in an attempt to protect the president and his wife. Hill was only inches away from John F. Kennedy when he took that fatal shot to the head. He forced a panicked Jackie Kennedy to remain in her seat where she held her dying husband's head in her lap. The agent surveyed the profound injuries to the president and quickly realized that he wasn't likely to survive. According to Hill's memoir, the First Lady screamed out, "Jack, Jack, what have they done to you?" For decades after the assassination, Hill harbored extraordinary guilt over the fact that the president had died on his watch. He subsequently developed a drinking problem, isolated himself from his family, and even contemplated suicide.
I tried to do the best job I could. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough.
President Kennedy had suffered from back issues for most of his adult life, even undergoing multiple surgeries to help alleviate his near-constant pain. When making public appearances, Kennedy would wear a back brace that was a little like a corset. It covered his hips in addition to the majority of his back and was laced extremely tightly. All of that was then wrapped in a constricting fabric bandage. The system kept everything in place and thereby limited the president's pain, but it also seriously restricted his movements. The corset prevented even natural involuntary movements, and that may have been a contributing factor to his death. Kennedy was wearing the apparatus under his clothes when he rode in his limousine through Dallas. After he was shot the first time, his body likely would have recoiled, hunched over, and fallen to the floor of the car had the president been unencumbered. Instead, his body remained upright in the seat, giving Lee Harvey Oswald his chance to deliver the killing blow. When he heard the first shot ring out, Governor John Connally instantly realized what was happening. He looked across his right shoulder to see if Kennedy was all right, but couldn't see exactly what had happened. He then began to turn to his left, at which point he felt the bullet enter his body. Oswald's second bullet pierced one of the governor's lungs, and he required a 4-hour operation to remove it and repair the damage. In the end, he fully recovered from his injuries, but things could have turned out a lot worse for him had he not moved the way he did. The day after the shooting, attending physician Dr. Tom Shires told UPI, if he had not turned, that bullet would have gone through the middle of his back and probably would have punctured his heart. Obviously, Oswald intended to shoot and kill President Kennedy that day, and he also landed a shot on Governor Connally. But one more individual nearly died at Oswald's hand on November 22nd. James Tague, a 27-year-old Dallas car salesman, arrived at Dealey Plaza just as the presidential motorcade was winding through the area. Late for a lunch appointment, Tague parked his car to get out to see why crowds had gathered. Mere seconds later, he heard a popping sound. At first, he thought it was a firecracker. Then he noticed the distinctive sound of 2 rifle shots. He later told the BBC, and with those last 2 shots, I felt something sting me in the face. He ran for cover behind an underpass pylon as the motorcade drove away. After speaking with 2 police officers who noticed blood on his face, Tague pieced together what had happened. He'd been struck by a piece of curb that flew into the air, dislodged by one of Oswald's bullets.
It's hard to grasp. Today, I'm still trying to grasp it.
Contrary to popular belief, Kennedy didn't die instantly in his car on Dealey Plaza. Instead, he suffered a long and slow demise, one that proved unspeakably harrowing for his wife. Following the assault, the driver of the presidential vehicle immediately went to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where President Kennedy was rushed into emergency surgery, but Kennedy's prognosis was never good. He arrived at the medical facility in what was described as just near the point of death. The president died on the operating table at Parkland. As Kennedy was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the rest of the world attempted to come to terms with what had just happened.
President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
Some reactions, though, were stranger than others. For example, the hospital where Kennedy was treated for his mortal wounds received a large volume of prank phone calls. When the Army Signal Corps took control of Parkland's outgoing phone lines, the hospital's switchboard operators were tasked with fielding and logging all received calls. Callers rang in from as far away as Europe, Australia, and South America. Many demanded more information, falsely claiming to be important people. One woman gave her identity only as the Underground and claimed she'd called to offer up her supernatural powers to heal the president. One man told the operator that he planned to blow up her car. Others blamed Kennedy's assassination on his support for the civil rights movement. One boy managed to call in 3 times, reaching 3 different operators. Each time, he claimed to be Kennedy's young son before laughing and hanging up. Secret Service agent Paul Landis was on Jackie Kennedy's security detail at the time of JFK's death. After witnessing the murder and the president's arrival at the hospital, Landis decided to investigate the car itself. That's when he noticed a spent bullet on the seat where Kennedy had been sitting. Landis, technically tampering with evidence, grabbed the bullet and placed it in his pocket. After entering the emergency room, he placed the bullet on the dying president's gurney, theorizing that it ought to remain with the body.
Yeah, I didn't want that to disappear. It was an important piece of evidence.
Landis was never interviewed by the Warren Commission, and he never publicly revealed that he'd taken the bullet until his memoir in 2023. In the book, Landis claimed that he'd simply forgotten to mention it to anyone. Pretty much every investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy has used the same historical document as a starting point, a 26.6-second piece of 8mm film captured by hobbyist photographer Abraham Zapruder. The unflinching footage graphically depicts the president sustaining multiple gunshots to his head and neck. Today, it could feasibly be considered one of history's most recognizable pieces of film footage. On November 22nd, Zapruder had been standing in a spot on Dealey Plaza where he was able to get a clear view of the presidential motorcade. But when the shots were fired, Zapruder became a direct and primary witness to the killing. Zapruder later told a reporter, "I saw the president lean over to Jacqueline, then the second shot came, and then I realized I saw his head open up and I started yelling, 'They killed him, they killed him!' And I continued shooting until they went under the underpass." The moment deeply impacted Zapruder's mental health. He said, "It's left in my mind like a wound that heals up, but yet there's a pain left as to what has happened." His camera was seized by the government and now sits in the National Archives. He was later given a new one, but never touched it or any other camera ever again. The events of November 22, 1963 loom large in the history of the United States. The first presidential murder in more than 60 years unnerved the nation, especially since it had occurred during a time of relative peace and prosperity. Considering the vast impact of the assassination in the country's cultural memory, it might seem surprising that the actual timeline of events is so short. President Kennedy's plane, Air Force One, touched down at Dallas's Love Field Airport at 11:30 a.m. There, the first couple were greeted by the media and well-wishers. By 11:45 a.m., John and Jackie Kennedy, John Connally, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, and their spouses had been loaded into open-topped cars bound for Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas. The motorcade reached its destination at 12 p.m., slowly driving through the streets lined with more than 150,000 locals who wanted to get a glimpse at the president. At 12:30 p.m., Oswald opened fire, hitting Kennedy and Connally. Rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, Kennedy was pronounced dead 1 hour and 3 minutes later. And just 12 minutes after that, Oswald was arrested in a movie theater. At 2:38 p.m., Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States on board Air Force One during a flight back to Washington. The entire course of events, from JFK's arrival in Dallas to Johnson's ascension, had occurred in a little over 3 hours.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet.
Within hours after the shooting of President Kennedy, police arrested Oswald, and the legal system worked quickly against him. The very next day, on November 23rd, Oswald was arraigned on charges relating to the murders of both the president and a police officer he'd killed during his escape. On November 24th, Oswald was transported from Dallas's police headquarters building to a county jail that could provide better security. And that's when things went wrong. Officials and members of the media crowded into the station's basement as police escorted Oswald through. Just then, local nightclub owner Jack Ruby pushed his way through the onlookers and shot Oswald at point-blank range. Oswald died from his wounds around 2 hours later. What's especially notable about Oswald's death is that it was witnessed live by potentially thousands, if not millions, of people. TV news crews were among the crowd in the police headquarters basement that day, and they were broadcasting the Oswald transfer live as it happened, coast to coast. This made Oswald's death the first known televised murder in history, and marked an ignominious end for one of American history's most mysterious criminals. Was there a practical reason for President Kennedy having 2 caskets, or was the government trying to cover up something about his assassination? The real reason may not be what you expected. After President John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas, he was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital. It was there that he was pronounced dead shortly after noon on November 22, 1963.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed.
The president was then placed into a casket so that his body could be flown back to Washington, D.C. By the time his body arrived in the nation's capital, the casket's interior was in a terrible state, as the president's wounds were leaking blood, brain matter, and bodily fluids. The president was so badly injured that the doctors who performed the autopsy wrote in their report, "It is our opinion that the wound of the skull produced such extensive damage to the brain as to preclude the possibility of the deceased surviving this injury." Since the casket was no longer suitable for the president's planned funeral in Washington, D.C., he was transferred to a new one. As the Los Angeles Times reports, the 2 Kennedy caskets fueled conspiracy theories surrounding his assassination. But in 1999, classified documents were unsealed, thus revealing the true story. As the timeline goes, the first casket Kennedy was stored in was procured from O'Neill's funeral home located in Dallas. After the president was pronounced dead, his body was wrapped in sheets and loaded into this first casket. Meanwhile, the interior of the casket was covered in plastic. However, these measures proved insufficient, so officials found a second casket for it. In that second casket, Kennedy lay in state for 2 days in the Capitol Rotunda and was later buried at Arlington National Cemetery. As those unsealed classified documents disclose, his first casket was kept in the National Archives vault in D.C. Then 3 years after the president was killed, the first casket was dropped into the ocean. According to classified documents, it was the president's brother Robert F. Kennedy who made the request. According to CBS News, Robert told archive officials, "What I would like to have done is take it to sea." It's interesting to note that since Kennedy was a naval veteran, he once thought that he'd be buried at sea. So, in a way, the first casket endured the same watery fate that the 35th president once envisioned for himself. However, Kermit L. Hall, a one-time member of the Assassination Records Review Board, told the Los Angeles Times that the first casket was ultimately disposed of so that it didn't turn into a historic relic for the marketplace. Still, dropping the first casket into the ocean was no small undertaking. In order to do this, 42 holes had to be drilled into it. From there, the casket was weighed down with sandbags, thus ensuring it sank. The casket also had 2 parachutes attached. This was to prevent it from breaking apart once it hit the water. The casket was then taken from its storage unit at the archives and loaded onto a C-130 aircraft. It reportedly now resides in an area off the Maryland-Delaware coast where the U.S. military sinks older gear that's no longer in use. As Kermit L. Hall told the Los Angeles Times, Kennedy's first casket is now in 9,000 feet of water in the Atlantic Ocean. Before these revelations, some thought the first casket was disposed of in a cover-up. But conspiracy theories aside, the casket was the subject of some actual controversy involving the price. Since officials needed a casket for the president quickly, O'Neill's funeral home charged them $3,995. In 2023, that price amounts to around $40,000. However, when the first casket was determined to be unusable, the government brought it back to O'Neill's. After some haggling, the funeral home offered to take the casket back, even in its used condition. When word got out that O'Neill's was in possession of the first casket, collectors started showing up and making offers to buy it. At one point, the funeral home was reportedly offered as much as $100,000 for the casket, or about $1 million in 2023.
As an entire nation mourned the loss of the 35th U.S. president, few truly knew all the details of what happened behind the scenes. When President John F. Kennedy headed to Dallas for that fateful November day, no one expected that the following week would be taken over by his funeral. That said, it's worth noting that things actually happened pretty fast. JFK was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. on November 22nd, and LBJ was sworn in about an hour and a half later. Although there's a general sort of outline that's followed for state funerals, it was Jackie Kennedy who insisted on several additions that were modeled after the funeral of Abraham Lincoln. Before that, though, JFK's body was rushed back to Washington, D.C. Jackie refused to change out of her blood-stained pink suit until the morning after the assassination, when she and JFK's casket returned to the White House's East Room. JFK's casket left the White House 2 days to the hour after he was killed. From there, it was transported to the Capitol Rotunda to lie in state for 21 hours. Somewhere around 250,000 people paid their respects in person. The funeral procession escorted him to the funeral mass at St. Matthew's. After a ceremony lasting exactly 1 hour and 16 minutes, one of the nation's most endearing presidents was escorted to Arlington National Cemetery. As a Secret Service agent on duty at that fateful Dallas parade, Clint Hill was the one that famously jumped on the back of the presidential limo, pushing Jackie Kennedy down into the back seat for protection. In his book, 5 Presidents: My Extraordinary Journey with Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford, Hill recounted the final time that JFK's casket was opened. He was in the East Room of the White House when Jackie and Robert Kennedy requested that the honor guard step away for a moment and the flag be pulled back so they could see him one more time. Hill recalled opening the casket and stepping back even as Jackie asked him to find her a pair of scissors. He did as she asked, listening to her tears as she cut a few locks of hair. It was Robert who closed the casket that final time, then escorted her out of the room. Hill wrote, "General McHugh and I checked the casket to make sure it was securely closed, and out of habit, I looked at my watch to take note of the time. 12:46 p.m. I had seen President Kennedy for the last time. The casket would never be opened again." For the entirety of JFK's funeral, even the private mass conducted only for the family, his casket remained closed, but not for the reasons you might think. According to the New York Times, the real reason that Jackie Kennedy ordered her husband's casket to remain closed was to remain in line with emerging Roman Catholic beliefs. It was rooted in the idea that after death, the body was nothing more than an empty shell, and the spirit had moved on to eternal life elsewhere. Actually viewing the body after death was thought to be a distraction that encouraged mourners to focus on what had been lost in the physical realm instead of what awaited in the spiritual one. Hence, JFK's casket remained closed.
There's only one word to describe the picture here, and that's grief.
One of the most iconic sights of John F. Kennedy's funeral was also among the oldest. The riderless horse, boots turned backwards in the stirrups, harkens back to a time when horses were sacrificed to accompany their riders into the afterlife. For JFK, that horse was an Army quartermaster-issued gelding named Black Jack, and on the day of JFK's funeral, he was anything but docile. Black Jack and his handler, Arthur Carlson, escorted JFK throughout the funeral parade, and not only did the crowds and the sound of a grate being dragged along the pavement completely spook him, but he danced, pranced, and pawed for miles. Carlson was unable to do anything, as protocol dictated he basically stay silent and keep walking. Along the way, Black Jack actually stomped on his foot outside St. Matthew's. He recalled to 12 WSFA, "I was actively afraid that the horse would get away from me." Jackie Kennedy bought Black Jack when he retired from military service. Never a riding horse, he retired in 1973 and died in 1976. His longtime human companion, Nancy Shadow, described his uncharacteristically difficult behavior on the day of the funeral as something deep. He wasn't used to assassinations. He was showing his objection to what happened. Animals sense things. Among those saying goodbye to John F. Kennedy on that bleak November day were his children. As if that famous photo of little JFK Jr. saluting his father's casket one last time isn't heartbreaking enough, consider this. It was his 3rd birthday. Stan Stearns, who worked for United Press International, and Dan Farrell, who worked for the New York Daily News, were the only 2 photographers who snapped that iconic moment. When Stearns passed away in 2012, the Washington Post ran a retrospective of the funeral with his obituary. Largely unseen by those who watched the funeral on television was the press box, with around 70 photographers crammed into an area measured for a few dozen. As they all tried getting photos of the funeral procession, many didn't even see little JFK Jr.'s final goodbye. He explained via the Washington Post, "As the caisson was rolling out to Arlington Cemetery, I asked every photographer I could if they had the salute. Duh, nobody saw it. Everyone I talked to had been concentrating on Jackie and the caisson." Stearns, however, had seen Jackie pause to say something to her young son, and with the forethought that makes a really good photographer, he kept his camera on the little boy. According to the Washington Post, he later reflected, "1 exposure on a roll of 36 exposures." When around 250,000 mourners converged on Washington, D.C. to pay their final respects to JFK, one of the things witnesses reported was the silence. According to the book 4 Days, the historical record of the death of President Kennedy, United Press International documented the quiet crowds. As they turned to look at the flag-covered coffin, mourners seldom showed tears, and most had a kind of blankness. The entire nation joined in on that silence to a certain extent. According to Reuters, the Nielsen TV ratings group reported that 81% of homes with a television were watching the funeral. When surveys were conducted later, the majority of people who watched the funeral reported having a physical reaction to it. Perhaps an even better measure of how the nation mourned along with the Kennedy family was when the televisions were turned off. A massive drop in viewers was noted at the same time JFK's funeral mass started.
I will repeat with the greatest regret, 2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he has died of bullet wounds.
Jackie Kennedy had a few requests when it came to her husband's funeral, and with one, JFK became the only U.S. president to have a foreign military presence at his gravesite. That foreign military was Ireland, and getting there was no small challenge. When cadets at a County Kildare barracks were issued an invitation to come and perform a centuries-old, deeply meaningful drill at JFK's grave, they were out on a short leave. Summoned back from as far away as Dublin, they had hours to prep the Queen Anne drill, which was once used to honor 17th century soldiers. This very drill had, in fact, so impressed JFK when he'd seen the previous class perform it just months before his death. After practicing for an hour, they grabbed some sleep, hopped on a plane, and were met by the Secretary of State on the other side. And when they got to the funeral, it wasn't what they expected. James Serenian, who went on to become the Chief of Staff for the Irish Defence Forces, told the Irish Examiner, "We were told that you're going to carry out the drill at the gravesite. But as Irish and American funeral traditions can be pretty different, it wasn't clear to the cadets what they were being asked to do, especially given the fact that they knew the U.S. Army was going to be there front and center." Serenian recalled, "It was an absolute shock that we were standing right at the graveside." Lyndon B. Johnson went from JFK's second to the president of a grieving and shocked nation. Even as he appeared in public, mourning alongside other mourners, behind the scenes, it was a bit of a different story. In his memoir, The Vantage Point: Perspectives of the Presidency, Johnson wrote that he had immediately considered himself fortunate that JFK had always included him in foreign affairs discussions and kept him up to date. That said, the funeral was attended by scores of world leaders, and for Johnson, it was a time to watch, observe, and talk to them for the first time as president. Some meetings were incredibly strained. When Francis Charles de Gaulle landed in D.C., it wasn't long after making comments that the U.S. couldn't be depended on, especially if European countries found themselves at war with the Soviet Union. Johnson noted in his memoir, "Like every American, my own spirit was heavy with grief, but the work had to go on. There was the frenzied pace of meetings and briefings held behind closed doors, then the measured cadence of the funeral march. There was the harsh glare of office light burning deep into the night, then the somber hush and the dim, soft light in the East Room from the 4 large candles flanking John Kennedy's coffin." In his memoir, As I Saw It, then Secretary of State Dean Rusk wrote about the chaos of not only arranging a funeral, but making sure everything went according to plan, even as they feared this was just the beginning of more trouble. Some leaders were viewed as more at risk than others. He wrote, "We were especially concerned about French President Charles de Gaulle's personal security during the Kennedy funeral. Political tensions were high in France, resulting in threats to his personal safety." George Ball was the Undersecretary of State at the time, and in his memoir, The Past Has Another Pattern, he echoed Rusk's concerns. In addition to fears of a larger plot, there was also the reaction to consider. Would extremist groups take matters into their own hands? Ball also mentioned speculation that de Gaulle could be a target, along with leaders from the Soviet Union. Concern was so great that Ball didn't attend the funeral at all. He wrote that he was instead tasked with standing by as the first line of defense if there was another assassination attempt or other political emergency. He was actually fine with it. He wrote in his memoir, "I have a distaste for the pomp and panoply of state funerals. We were treating the dead president as a king, rather than as a warm, human, lively, glittering young American elected by the popular vote of a great nation." The eternal flame remains one of the most powerful symbols of John F. Kennedy's impact on the U.S., and it was first lit at his funeral. The moment was somber and just as powerful as the imagery of it, but behind the scenes, it had been a wild scramble to get the temporary flame installed. It came together thanks to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Inspired by Paris's eternal flame at their memorial to the unknown soldier, Jackie Kennedy asked for an eternal flame for JFK's grave the day before he was buried there. According to Lieutenant General Walter K. Wilson Jr.'s book, Engineer Memoirs, the hurried work was done from scratch even as the lying in state had begun. Without time for plans to be drawn up, the flame was cobbled together, based around a propane tank and a tiki torch. 30 hours and one test lighting later, Jackie lit the eternal flame.
Eventually, engineers designed a permanent structure with 2 gas lines running to the flame.
Wilson wrote about feeling grateful that he'd been a part of the task, as it had been an important addition to the proceedings. He noted in his memoir, "Little things like that helped ease the pain." Colonel Clayton B. Lyle, who made the torch, echoed those sentiments, saying it was one of the most important moments of his decades-long career.
This is a 1961 Lincoln Continental. Lincoln had a whole new design that year, very clean, very elegant, very modern.
The midnight blue Lincoln Continental was built by the Ford Motor Company in 1961. To make it fit for use during presidential parades, modifications were done by Hess and Eisenhardt, a coach building company that specialized in armored vehicles. According to the Henry Ford Museum, the two companies collaborated to customize the vehicle. Secret Service codenamed X100. The original Lincoln Continental was cut in half, and a 3.5-foot extension was added to lengthen it. The vehicle included removable roof panels, heating and air conditioning systems, flashing red lights, 2 radio telephones, and a hydraulic seat to elevate the president. The original car cost about $7,300. The added features cost almost $200,000. Approximately $1.8 million in today's money. The Ford Motor Company remained the owner of the presidential limousine, leasing it to the Secret Service for roughly $500 a year. Most of us might assume that the vehicle was retired after President Kennedy's assassination. That wasn't the case. According to the New York Daily News, the presidential limousine was transported back to the White House via cargo plane, kept for evidence while it was documented and analyzed by the Warren Commission, the FBI, and the Secret Service. The windshield, which was hit by a bullet, was removed. The White House authorized work to repair and modify the Lincoln Continental in December 1963. For the Henry Ford Museum, it was sent to Hess and Eisenhardt in Cincinnati, Ohio, where it was rebuilt. It was then transported to Ford Motor Company's garage in Dearborn, Michigan to receive new black paint, reinforced structural parts, additional communication technology, a non-removable top, and armor for the passenger compartments. In total, the modifications reportedly cost $500,000 to complete, about $4.6 million in today's money. According to Old Cars Weekly, Kennedy's presidential limousine was used by presidents throughout the years, including Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. As Motor Biscuit explains, President Johnson only used the Lincoln Continental a few times during his presidency, as he was not completely comfortable. He opted to ride in other cars with the White House fleet whenever possible. Other presidential vehicles were built in 1968 and 1972. Kennedy's Lincoln Continental remained a part of the White House fleet until it was finally retired in 1977. It was then sent to the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation located in Dearborn, Michigan, and it is displayed together with other cars built by the Ford Motor Company. To this day, the JFK Lincoln Continental remains one of the museum's most popular displays. With its shiny exterior and superb condition, those who aren't aware of the vehicle's story wouldn't think that it is one of the most notorious vehicles in American history. Some of the museum's visitors leave flowers by the Lincoln Continental, especially on November 22nd, anniversary of Kennedy's death.
A few days after the assassination of her husband, President John F. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy sat down for an interview with Theodore H. White for a Life magazine story. White was a journalist and historian who received a Pulitzer Prize the year before for his coverage of the 1960 presidential election that JFK had won. Though the interview started out slowly, Jackie suddenly rushed headlong into her memories of that horrific day in Dallas. She stared into space as she recounted the tragic story. As the presidential motorcade slowly made its way through downtown Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963, Jackie Kennedy sat next to her husband. She was wearing a pink Chanel suit with a matching pillbox hat and white gloves. She cradled a bouquet of red roses she'd recently been given by well-wishers as she smiled and waved. Suddenly, she heard a crack. She thought it was the sound of a motorcycle backfiring, according to These Few Precious Days, a book by Christopher Anderson. According to the same book, Jackie recounted later that her husband had a quizzical look on his face, saying, "He looked puzzled. I remember he looked as if he had a slight headache."
President Kennedy and Governor John Connally have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas.
Her interpretation of the gunshots lasted only as long as it took to look at her husband. She told White, "Jack turned back so neatly. His last expression was so neat. I could see a piece of his skull coming off. He was holding out his hand and I could see this perfectly clean piece detaching itself from his head. Then he slumped in my lap." An incident that Jackie had no memory of occurred just seconds after the shots rang out. At one point, she had lunged toward the back of the convertible in what many thought was an attempt to jump out of the vehicle. In truth, she was trying to retrieve a piece of her husband's skull that had landed on the car's trunk. After the shots were fired, their dark blue 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible began to race past the confused onlookers who lined the motorcade route. Jackie screamed, staring blankly into space. As the car continued onto Stemmons Freeway to Parkland Memorial Hospital, Jackie tried to hold her husband's head together. She leaned down close to him and whispered, "Jack, Jack, Jack, can you hear me? I love you, Jack." It was the last thing she said to her husband, who was barely alive, breathing raggedly, his pulse barely perceptible. 7 minutes later, they were at Parkland Hospital and he was still alive, but a half hour later, doctors declared him dead.
Two priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead.
When the motorcade arrived at the hospital, Jackie Kennedy refused to leave her husband's side. His body lay on a stretcher with one foot, wider than the sheet covering him, sticking out. Jackie went over and kissed him. She pulled back the sheet and looked at her dead husband. She recalled the moment later, saying, "His mouth was so beautiful. His eyes were open." She again kissed him, working her way up his body until she reached his lips. She held his hand while a Catholic priest gave him last rites. Hours later, a dazed Jackie was on Air Force One, still wearing her blood-splattered outfit at the swearing-in of Lyndon B. Johnson as the next president. Her husband's body, now in a bronze coffin, was also on board. On November 24th, the day JFK's body was to lay in state, Jackie and Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother, went to the East Room in the White House to say one final goodbye before the casket lid was shut for the last time.
Its poignancy calls only for tears.
When historians call Lee Harvey Oswald enigmatic, they're severely underplaying just how mysterious he was. There's a lot we don't know about the 20th century's most infamous assassin. We don't know why he did it, and we don't know why he spent the weeks before the assassination hanging out in Mexico City. As Professor T. Jeremy Gunn put it to NPR, back then the city was, quote, the spy capital of the Western Hemisphere. Cuban agents, Soviet moles, and CIA operatives all rubbed shoulders there, and Oswald was among them, raises all sorts of questions.
It's a mystery wrapped in a riddle inside an enigma!
We do know Oswald used his time in Mexico to try and secure a Soviet visa. We don't know why the records of this are all screwed up. The day he visited the Soviet embassy just happens to be the day the CIA's camera wasn't working, so we have no pictures. We once had a recording of a tapped phone call from a guy claiming to be Oswald. The controversial former FBI director J. Edgar Hoover decided it wasn't Oswald's voice, so the tape vanished. That's before we get on to the random guys Oswald was with. According to Politico, CIA informers saw Oswald with two young Americans at a party in the city. We still haven't established their identities. All we know is that they spent a few days hanging out with a soon-to-be presidential assassin and then vanished forever. One of the spies in Mexico City at the time of Oswald's visit was June or Jerry Cobb, an Oklahoma girl who turned pro-Castro revolutionary before becoming disgusted with Cuba and turning CIA spy. Cobb was a valuable intelligence asset. Her claims were usually taken seriously, so when she followed up Kennedy's assassination by telling her CIA handlers Oswald had been seen at a Mexico City party where people joked about killing JFK, you better believe the feds listened. The story comes via Politico, and we should say here that its specifics remain shrouded in mystery. Cobb's file is still under lock and key for security reasons, so Politico's reporting comes only from related CIA and FBI files. Still, it's fascinating reading. Mexican playwright Elena Garro reported the party to Cobb, saying it was a meeting place for Cuban diplomats. Some were even joking about how useful it'd be if Kennedy was killed. Garro's information was so shocking that the FBI interviewed her in 1964, but Cobb's intel was disparaged by the CIA, and no follow-up action seems to have been taken. No evidence connecting the assassination to Cuba or the Soviets has ever surfaced, even after the opening of the KGB files. Still, it does make you wonder what exactly happened at that party and just what Oswald was doing there. Perhaps the strangest thing about Oswald is that he was under heavy surveillance by U.S. intelligence agencies after defecting from and returning to the U.S. So how was he not stopped? On October 16, 1959, he arrived in Moscow and wrote to the Soviet authorities, renouncing his American citizenship. Then, when the Kremlin rejected his overtures, Oswald tried to kill himself. That was enough to grant him a temporary stay in the USSR. The KGB shipped him off to Minsk to work in a radio factory. According to Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Anthony Summers, Oswald later claimed he'd offered the Soviets information on America's U-2 spy planes.
No, sir, I am not a communist. I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
Flash forward to June 1962, and Oswald was back in the States, this time with a Soviet wife and newborn daughter. Given his history, you'd probably expect his return to be announced by dozens of men in dark glasses bundling him out of the airport and into a mobile interrogation chamber. Yet the CIA never questioned him. The FBI did question him twice after his return, and once again on August 10, 1963, after he was arrested for disturbing the peace by handing out pro-Castro flyers. But for whatever reason, a defector was given free rein to waltz around the country until he shot the president. In the video of Ronald Reagan being shot, the first shot goes off, and within a split second, the president has been whisked away while John Hinckley Jr. vanishes beneath a sea of bodies. Now compare the Kennedy assassination. The first bullet hits JFK in the throat, and the Secret Service does nothing. The second bullet is the headshot that killed Kennedy. 5 seconds passed between the two shots. A high-speed Reagan-style response could have saved the president. Driver William Greer didn't take evasive action. Paul Landis, following the Kennedy car, didn't jump on board and shield the president with his body. The Secret Service guy you see jumping onto the car in the assassination footage, that's Clint Hill, part of the First Lady's detail, fulfilling his duty to protect Jackie. Interviews with Secret Service personnel by Vanity Fair talk about a macho culture where members would refuse food and sleep and spend every night getting crazy drunk. While a no-sleep hangover would explain their inaction, it doesn't explain other weird screw-ups, like why the running boards on JFK's car were retracted, meaning there was no one to protect the president if something happened. Then something happened.
John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas.
Following Kennedy's assassination, officials tried to trace all possible witnesses.
It was just right by us when it all happened, just right in front of us.
Many were known only by nicknames like Umbrella Man, the Three Tramps, or Badge Man. It took until the 1990s to track most down, or in the case of Badge Man, proved they probably didn't exist, and the hunt isn't over. We still have no idea who the Babushka Lady was. Known for her Russian-style headscarf, the Babushka Lady was on Dealey Plaza filming the assassination. A piece of film would be of unimaginable historical importance. People have been searching for her for decades. In 1970, a woman named Beverly Oliver surfaced, claiming to be the mystery woman. But she said she knew who really killed Martin Luther King Jr. and claimed she was recording JFK's death with a camera that hadn't been invented yet, so serious historians tend to dismiss her. That means there's someone out there with unseen footage of a major historical event who has never turned herself in. So if you're a headscarf-loving woman who was in Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963, your local FBI office would love to hear from you. After JFK's death, things only got weirder. The body was taken to Dallas Parkland Memorial Hospital, but it barely got through the doors before a fight broke out over who got to perform the autopsy. The local coroner was Earl Rose. Since Kennedy was killed in Texas, he felt it was a state crime that Texas law applied and that he was responsible for the post-mortem. According to the LA Times, however, the Secret Service and Jackie Kennedy disagreed. Things quickly got ugly.
I'm the medical examiner. This is a homicide case. The deceased can't leave until there's been an autopsy.
When Rose tried to physically block the Secret Service from the body, a heated argument broke out. At some point, Kennedy's detail simply grabbed the body. According to some accounts, guns were drawn. Either way, the outcome was the same. Kennedy's remains were transported to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. Likely as a result of this dispute, there's no longer any ambiguity. A 1965 code makes it clear that attempting to assassinate the commander-in-chief is a federal crime. Given its importance, you might expect JFK's autopsy was done with the utmost diligence. But not only were parts of the autopsy done in a strange way, a whole lot of crazy issues surfaced later. When you're autopsying a body, there are specific procedures you should follow. Removing and weighing the organs is one, something autopsy Dr. James Joseph Humes admitted in 1996 hadn't been done. This pales in comparison to the other things Humes didn't do. He didn't preserve the original JFK autopsy report. He made a handwritten copy, then burned the original. Humes claimed he wanted to stop the blood-stained report from becoming a source of morbid fascination. On the other hand, he failed to destroy at least one other blood-stained document.
People in our government tampered with critical evidence in order to make sure the American people would not know the truth about who murdered the president.
Then there are the autopsy photos. The ones in the National Archive are low quality and don't show important details like the number of bullet wounds. When Professor Gunn showed them to the woman who developed them, Sandra Spencer, as part of his work on the 1992 Assassination Records Review Board, she said they didn't look like the images she remembered processing.
She said that the photographs that she developed had a large massive exit wound in the back of the head.
Next, Gunn tried to match them to photos printed by Spencer's lab shortly before the assassination. The photo paper was completely different, suggesting they came from a different printing session. It sometimes seems the only thing that could shed more light on what happened in Dealey Plaza that day is a deathbed confession from a professional assassin. Well, buckle up, because that deathbed confession exists.
Many strange things were happening, and your Lee Harvey Oswald had nothing to do with them.
In 1966, Herminio Diaz Garcia, a hitman for the Cuban Mafia, died during a raid on a prison. Before he expired, he told fellow mobster Tony Cuesta he'd been responsible for the death of the US president. That's the story investigative journalist Anthony Summers tells in his book on the assassination, Not in Your Lifetime. In 2007, Summers and Robert Blakey, a former chief counsel to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, interviewed Cuban exile Ronaldo Martinez Gomez, who also spoke with The Telegraph in 2013. Gomez said he'd shared a cell with Cuesta, who told him about Diaz's confession. In fact, Diaz was in the United States on November 23, 1963, and had previously carried out 20 political assassinations. Of course, this is just one man's word, and hitmen tend to lie, but there are other bizarre Cuban connections to JFK's murder. Also in 2007, former Kennedy detail Secret Serviceman Abraham Bolden told ABC about a tip-off the service received ahead of JFK's aborted trip to Chicago on November 2, 1963. Two Cuban men with rifles were spotted in a rented room along the motorcade route, but the surveillance operation against them was bungled and the potential assassins vanished. Kennedy was a beloved president, while Sam Giancana was a violent mobster who once worked for Al Capone.
Declined to answer because I honestly believe my answer might tend to incriminate him.
Yet if you were to read books on the lives of both Kennedy and Giancana, you'd find they keep cropping up in each other's stories. The coincidences add fuel to the rumors that the Mafia killed Kennedy for riding hard on them. Giancana had ties to JFK's dad, Joseph P. Kennedy, from Prohibition.
The old man Kennedy was a very close friend of Giancana's. They were in business together in the old days in the bootlegging business.
But the ties may have gone deeper. In 1997, reporter Seymour Hersh wrote in his book The Dark Side of Camelot that Joe Kennedy asked Giancana to help his son win the 1960 election. Then there's Frank Sinatra, who was friends with both JFK and Giancana. Frank's daughter Tina later claimed that her father asked Giancana to lean on the unions to help JFK win the Democratic primaries. JFK and Giancana also shared a mistress, Judith Campbell Exner, who said in 1988 that she arranged secret meetings between them.
I can, at this time, emphatically state that my relationship with Jack Kennedy was of a close personal nature.
The strangest part of all may concern not Kennedy's death, but Giancana's. The mob boss was used by the CIA to attempt to hit on Castro. Just before he could testify before the Senate's Church Committee about his work with the agency, Giancana himself was assassinated. There's almost no official record of Oswald's questioning by Dallas police or the FBI. The interrogators didn't use a tape recorder and had no stenographers present to take accurate notes. Records of the interrogation of the 20th century's most notorious assassin come solely in the form of handwritten notes made by the two interviewers. These notes are rough and incomplete, offering only the tiniest glimpse inside Oswald's psyche. And incredibly, we only have one set of these notes today, and that's because they were discovered among the personal belongings of former police captain J.W. Fritz in the 1990s and anonymously donated. Fritz's notes are very clear on one thing. Oswald repeatedly protested his innocence, claiming that the images of him posing with the rifle used to kill Kennedy were faked. Conspiracy implications aside, this at least suggests Oswald's motive wasn't fame or notoriety. In the decades since Kennedy's death, a whole bunch of records and important documents have vanished. The Mary Farrell Foundation maintains an online database regarding the missing records. While many of the foundation's conspiracy theory claims are unsupported, the missing records are well cataloged. Among those vanished documents are a note written by Oswald and sent to the FBI, an Army intelligence file on Oswald, and Secret Service records relating to a trip JFK nearly took to Chicago in November 1963. In addition, there's some evidence the Marine Corps, of which Oswald had been a member, launched its own investigation after the assassination, but no documents from it have ever surfaced. Perhaps even weirder is the story of the missing page from Oswald's notebook, reported in the LA Times. Historian and journalist James Reston Jr. claims Secret Service agent Mike Howard checked Oswald's apartment after the assassination and found a notebook with a page headed, "I will kill." Underneath were the names of an FBI agent, a general, and Richard Nixon. Texas Governor John Connally was also listed with a dagger drawn through his name. Reston views this as more evidence that Oswald meant to kill Connally, who was riding in JFK's car and was badly injured in the assassination. Whether his interpretation is correct or not, it's a moot point. The page was torn out after Howard handed the book over and has been missing ever since. President Kennedy's brain is missing. In 1966, it was revealed to have vanished from a secure room at the National Archives. If you think that's weird, just wait. Historian James L. Swanson wrote in his book End of Days, The Assassination of John F. Kennedy, that he believed the thief was JFK's brother, Robert F. Kennedy. After Kennedy's autopsy, his brain was placed in a stainless steel container. It was kept along with several samples of brain tissue, first by the Secret Service, then at the National Archives. Being both important and utterly morbid, its time at the archives was spent under the watchful eye of JFK's former secretary. That makes its disappearance all the more mystifying. In October 1966, someone went looking for the brain and found it and all the tissue samples had vanished. The Attorney General immediately ordered an investigation. Half a century later, we're still waiting for it to turn up. So where does RFK fit in? Swanson's theory is that Kennedy's brother stole his brain to cover up the massive stew of drugs the president was taking.
Had the American public known just how sick Jack Kennedy was, he probably could not have been a presidential candidate.
According to the Telegraph, JFK was knocking back codeine, Demerol, and methadone for back pain, along with other pills for insomnia and anxiety. In July 2017, a handful of new files on JFK's death were released to the public. This was in accordance with a 1992 law that all records of the assassination had to be declassified by October 26, 2017. While most of the new files were little more than duplicates of already public material, they did contain one strange new nugget of information. From the Warren Commission onwards, the CIA publicly embraced the lone gunman theory that Oswald acted alone. But the new documents revealed that, by the mid-1970s, the CIA no longer believed this. Internally, the agency began to consider JFK's death part of a possible conspiracy, even as they continued to publicly support the theory that Oswald acted alone.
I know what it is to kill someone. You don't bounce and come this way. When you bounce and come this way, you got hit in the front.
What the CIA actually believed happened is vague and sometimes contradictory. Some agents seem to have started taking the Soviets and Cuba seriously as suspects. Others seem to have worried the killing was inadvertently related to their own work. This theory went that Oswald read about CIA assassination attempts on Castro and killed Kennedy in revenge. As Politico notes, if that proved true, it would have raised a terrible question for the CIA. Was it possible that JFK's assassination was blowback for the spy agency's plots to kill Castro?
What this indicates, and this was the judgment of the committee, is that our own people aren't as efficient as we might think they ought to be.
Whatever was really happening inside the agency, the CIA kept its concern private, even from other government agencies. Why they may have felt the need to do so is just one more oddity to add to the unexplained aspects of the JFK assassination. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the KGB files were briefly opened to researchers. Among them was a file that detailed Lee Harvey Oswald's time in the USSR. Before the files were closed again, Russian paper Izvestia reported on some of its contents in 1991. Rather than add clarity, the reports only further muddied the waters. As a defector, Oswald was of considerable interest to the KGB, yet the files reveal the Kremlin effectively thought he was useless. In the late 1950s, Oswald decamped to the Soviet Union, and the Secretive Government Security Office, the KGB, kept an eye on him. It was the opinion of the KGB that Oswald lacked the psychological profile that would have made him a useful asset. One especially noteworthy observation is that apparently Oswald was a pretty lousy shot. If you think the person who despised John F. Kennedy the most in the 1960 presidential race was Richard Nixon, that'd be a nope. Wrong side of the ticket. Turns out that LBJ hated JFK. Now, it's no secret that Lyndon Baines Johnson clashed with Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. That makes sense, given that RFK was his brother's chief lieutenant, a job that should have gone to the VP, and Johnson, as an alpha male and Texan, didn't like being brushed aside. Word around Washington was that he despised having to serve as vice president at all, like he was above it. Jackie Kennedy had a pleasant relationship with the Johnsons, but she later outed Jack's real feelings about Lyndon and Lady Bird. Apparently, Kennedy didn't think Johnson was contributing anything to the administration, and he even doubted his fitness to be president. Jack felt so strongly about it that in the months before the assassination, he talked with Bobby about ways to prevent Johnson from becoming the Democratic nominee in '68. So at least the feeling was mutual. Johnson thought the Kennedy brothers were snobby coastal elites, and he seemed to resent living in Kennedy's shadow even after the assassination. Apparently, the phrase, "Kennedy wouldn't have done that," followed Johnson for the rest of his life, to the point where he was recorded complaining about it long after the presidency was behind him. Kennedy wasn't crazy about Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the feeling was mutual. It wasn't so much their 27-year age difference as it was a clash of personality, at least on Kennedy's part. You see, Jack found the old general to be cold. Eisenhower, on the other hand, didn't like the idea of a young, inexperienced Jack Kennedy replacing him in the most powerful office in the world.
Kennedy, he thought, was just a junior senator from Massachusetts who was a novice, who knew nothing about the world at large.
There was also the part where he disagreed with nearly every major decision Kennedy made while president. But as a military man, Eisenhower understood the chain of command. Therefore, his lack of confidence in his successor reinforced his determination not to undermine Kennedy publicly and to offer support and advice where and when he could. In fact, Eisenhower was among those Kennedy consulted during the Cuban Missile Crisis. 2 years after the Kennedy assassination, the general saw a poll in which American historians were asked to rate the presidents. He resented what he perceived as an attempt to establish the late president as a seminal figure in American history by what he called the Kennedy cult. If Ike knew how bad those rankings got today, he'd be spinning in his grave. Throughout his life, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev insisted that he both liked and respected Jack Kennedy. The two met in 1959 when Kennedy was in the Senate, and Khrushchev was reportedly impressed. But that didn't mean he wasn't going to run roughshod over him one-on-one. He aimed to embarrass America during their 1961 Vienna summit, and truthfully, he probably did. He generally threw Kennedy for a loop with his brazen requests, like taking all of Berlin and putting it under East Germany's control. In the immediate aftermath of the meeting, Khrushchev allegedly boasted that Kennedy was spineless and incapable of facing a Soviet challenge, and Kennedy didn't entirely disagree. He admitted to his aides and even to the American press, off the record of course, that he'd been well and thoroughly had. But when it came time to write his memoir, Khrushchev Remembers, the Soviet premier glossed over this encounter, preferring to write about his fondness for Kennedy and his preference for Kennedy over Nixon or Dwight Eisenhower. He called Kennedy's death a great loss that damaged U.S.-Soviet relations. J. Edgar Hoover hated Jack Kennedy. That's it. We can move on to the next subject. All right, fine. Here's a bit more context. Even though Hoover and Joe Sr. respected each other, it didn't stop Hoover from collecting a file of compromising information on Jack. The crazy part is he started collecting dirt on Kennedy's affairs as early as 1942. When Kennedy became president, Hoover could barely hide his disdain for his philandering and wasn't too fond of the new president's politics either. The bad blood between Hoover and the Kennedy brothers was mutual. While JFK maintained a public show of respect toward Hoover, he neither liked nor trusted him. For obvious reasons, he had concern over his vast surveillance network. Kennedy reportedly wanted to fire Hoover, so it came as a surprise when just one day after his election in 1960, he announced that Hoover would stay on. This more than likely had to do with the leverage Hoover had collected on him over the years. Kennedy enjoyed getting little doses of revenge by barging in on Hoover when he was napping, or taking him to lunch at working-class diners instead of the fancy DC joints Hoover preferred. But as much as Jack disliked Edgar, the real tension was between Hoover and Bobby, who feared Hoover's power, opposed it when he could, and deeply resented his political machinations. If anyone has a reason to be ticked off at JFK, it's Sam Giancana, at least if you believe the Chicago outfit stole Illinois and therefore the 1960 election for Kennedy as part of a deal with his father.
To tell us whether if you have opposition from anybody that you dispose of them by having them stuffed in a trunk? Is that what you do, Mr. Giancana?
It didn't get that far. Well, unless you're all in on that Oswald theory. Since conspiracies are fun, let's lay it out again for you. RFK brought down heat on the mafia, and after all they did to get JFK elected, the nerves of him. So bosses Carlos Barcelo and Santo Trafficante went to Sam Giancana for help. The mobster and the president did have one thing in common: a mistress.
I can, at this time, emphatically state that my relationship with Jack Kennedy was of a close personal nature.
Her name was Judith Campbell Exner, and she later claimed Giancana bragged about putting Kennedy into the White House. One associate even claimed that Giancana confessed to arranging the president's assassination. Throughout his presidency, Kennedy faced significant opposition from within his own party. The Dixiecrats were a group of Southern Democratic politicians who were hostile to the Kennedy civil rights agenda. Chief among the Dixiecrats was Alabama Governor George Wallace, who in his 1963 inaugural address famously declared,
"Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever."
He was so violently opposed to admitting black students to the University of Alabama that he threatened to defy federal court orders and swore there would be rioting if that were to happen. The stand in the schoolhouse door is best remembered for the scene in Forrest Gump, but it really happened. Attorney General Bobby Kennedy intervened, and thanks to his efforts, the university was successfully integrated without violence, and Wallace-sanctioned chaos in the South was narrowly averted. Needless to say, at the time, George Wallace hated all the Kennedys. JFK followed up this achievement with a speech to the nation in which he announced his intention to pass a civil rights bill.
This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal.
In an often forgotten twist, Wallace denounced his segregationist views and worked to educate those who thought as he once did. George Wallace wasn't the only Dixiecrat to come into conflict with Kennedy over civil rights. 47-year South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond became infamous for staging a 24-hour-plus filibuster to prevent the passage of the 1957 Civil Rights Act. It was a failure, and the bill was passed 2 hours after he finally stopped talking. Thurmond kept pretty much mum about race back in the 1940s when he was governor of South Carolina, but by the time he reached the Senate, he was a full-throated racist. He detested Kennedy's civil rights bill and seemed to despise Kennedy himself so much it made him half crazy. For example, Thurmond insisted JFK was planning to surrender the entire U.S. nuclear arsenal to the United Nations. This was such an outrageous conspiracy theory that even newspapers that circulated in his home state of South Carolina went after him. In another odd twist, Thurmond also had a change of heart, and after flipping political parties in 1964, later became the first senator from a deep South state to hire an African-American staff. You'd be remiss to not give him a little credit to the changes Kennedy made to the overall attitude of the country with his policies. You might think the people we already mentioned hated JFK, but they've got nothing on Bertrand Russell. Here's how he described Kennedy. Much more wicked than Hitler, they are the wickedest people who ever lived in the history of man, and it is our duty to do what we can against them. So who in the blazes is Bertrand Russell? Well, he was a British philosopher and mathematician, a socialist, and really liked inserting himself into world problems. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Russell sent telegrams to both Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. Notably, Russell didn't criticize Russian policy regarding Cuba in his message to Khrushchev, but did reprimand Kennedy for America's blockade. He was a socialist, so at least that's on point. Russell rushed Khrushchev's conciliatory reply to Kennedy, who didn't appreciate Russell involving himself in an international crisis. When the crisis passed, Russell expressed regret for not taking a gentler tone with Kennedy, but he still thought JFK messed up during the crisis. In yet another twist, third in a row, after Kennedy's assassination, Russell weighed in, criticizing the makeup of the Warren Commission and its handling of the evidence. In short, he likened Oswald to the Dreyfus affair from 1800s France. In other words, he thought Oswald was a patsy. Countless CIA ops, ties to the mob, and oh so many romantic liaisons. JFK's administration is considered by many to be one of the better ones, but not everything about it was positive. The first questionable incident during the Kennedy administration actually occurred before JFK took office. One of the most pressing United States foreign policy matters in the early 1960s was the Cuban Revolution and the ascension of Fidel Castro to power. On the 1960 campaign trail, the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, briefed Kennedy on the current state of U.S. foreign policy. Dulles reportedly mentioned Cuba, but nothing specific about any covert plans for an attack, something the Eisenhower administration was secretly planning with the CIA and what would become the Bay of Pigs invasion. In their presidential debates, Kennedy's opponent Richard Nixon, who was vice president at the time, accused Kennedy of being weak on fighting communism in Cuba. Kennedy responded by putting out a statement in the New York Times that specifically called for the Eisenhower administration to help indigenous Cuban forces trying to oust Castro. Nixon, claiming he was protecting the integrity of the secret CIA operation, didn't acknowledge that the administration was doing exactly that. Instead, he called the idea dangerously irresponsible. Nixon was furious. He believed JFK knew about the invasion plan and was trying to make Nixon look bad. Nixon blamed his election loss on the incident. However, Dulles didn't brief Kennedy about the Cuba operation, and Nixon was mistaken. The 1960 presidential election was a remarkably close contest. Though in the Electoral College it appears to be a blowout, with John F. Kennedy winning 303 votes to Richard Nixon's 219, the popular vote was much closer, within 120,000 votes out of more than 68 million cast, or less than 0.5%. Leading up to the election, the polls had Kennedy and Nixon extremely close. Less than 3 months before, they were virtually tied in a Gallup poll, and on the eve of the election, they were within 1 percentage point of each other. Immediately after Kennedy's victory, however, there were claims of malfeasance, particularly in Illinois and Texas. Texas and Illinois combined for 47 electoral votes, which would have shifted the election to Nixon if he had taken both. Accusations poured in against Democratic Chicago Mayor Richard Daley and Kennedy's running mate Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a Texas senator at the time. Nixon supporters claimed both states engaged in ballot box stuffing and widespread voter fraud, insisting that the election was stolen. However, there has never been any conclusive indication of voter fraud from either state, though historians argue as to whether or not some discrepancies occurred in Illinois. Nixon never formally challenged the results. In 1959, Fidel Castro and his Revolutionary Army took power in Cuba. However, Castro soon drew the ire of Washington by entering contracts for Soviet oil and publicly announcing their comradeship with the USSR. The Eisenhower administration reacted to Castro's communist overtures by approving a CIA operation to remove him from power. The plan was to recruit Cuban exiles who had fled to Miami after the revolution, train them into paramilitaries, then send them back to oust Castro and take back control of the country. When Kennedy became president, he authorized the invasion, but it was a complete disaster.
Word of the invasion had leaked. Castro's forces outnumbered those landing at the beach, and local Cubans chose to stand with Castro.
Over 100 U.S.-trained Cuban paramilitaries were killed by the Cuban army, and nearly 1,200 were captured. Castro remained in power, and the Kennedy administration was thoroughly embarrassed less than 4 months into his presidency. Historians have laid much of the blame for the Bay of Pigs on decisions made by JFK. They mainly point to his insistence on starting the operation at night, his refusal to approve a second round of bombing, and his refusal to allow the Navy to back up Cuban forces. For many Americans living during the Cold War, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the scariest times of their entire lives. That October, the Kennedy administration announced they had discovered the Soviet Union was moving nuclear missiles onto the island of Cuba, barely 90 miles off the Florida coast. In response, Kennedy immediately instituted a blockade around Cuba and issued an ultimatum: remove the missiles or risk nuclear war.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
When a U.S. reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba on October 27th, war seemed inevitable. However, at the last minute, Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev agreed on a compromise that involved the removal of the Soviet weapons, and war was averted. Normally, JFK gets very high marks for his handling of the crisis, but what most people don't realize is that the Kennedy administration actually had information about the nuclear weapons a month and a half before. In fact, Kennedy first became aware of the sites after a spy plane photographed them on August 29th. But when he was informed, the president told his aides to bury the reports because he was worried about a scandal so close to the midterm elections. Then, after the U.S. spy plane was downed over Soviet territory weeks later, Kennedy grounded all U-2 flights over Cuba. That's how the Soviets moved 99 nuclear missiles on October 4th without the U.S. knowing. When U-2 flights restarted, the missiles were revealed, kicking off the crisis. After the Bay of Pigs invasion failed, the Kennedy administration was still looking to remove Castro from power. So in January 1962, less than a year later, Kennedy initiated Operation Mongoose. Mongoose was a plot to remove Castro from power once and for all, and JFK's brother Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, handpicked legendary CIA agent Edward Lansdale to plan it. But Lansdale wasn't the only CIA agent working on the job. Another man, William Harvey, was also a senior operative at the CIA, who started on the project after being assigned by the former head of the clandestine service, Richard Bissell. After struggling to make any headway for months, Harvey decided on a new tactic. They would use the mafia to assassinate Castro. Harvey got in contact with mobsters Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli. providing them with poison pills to give to Castro in Cuba, but the gangsters failed to carry out the hit. A second known assassination attempt under the JFK administration was a failed scheme to deliver Castro a scuba suit infected with fungus and tuberculosis bacillus. The suit was never delivered. After JFK's assassination in November 1963, the new president Lyndon Johnson shut Mongoose down. One of the biggest foreign policy issues that JFK inherited from the Eisenhower administration was a growing financial and military commitment to the fledgling Republic of Vietnam. Previously, when he served in the House and Senate in the early 1960s, Kennedy had gone on record against any U.S. engagement in Vietnam. During the first Indochina War between the Viet Minh and the French, he called the prospect of U.S. military aid to the French dangerously futile and self-destructive. However, by the time he was on the campaign trail in 1960, Kennedy was singing a different tune. Worried about Chinese Premier Mao Zedong's growing communist influence in Asia, JFK now favored much more aggressive tactics in Vietnam. He initiated a counterinsurgency strategy to combat the Viet Cong's use of guerrilla warfare and started to allow the direct participation of U.S. soldiers in battle against the communists. When Eisenhower left office in January 1961, there were only 700 so-called military advisors in Vietnam.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
Yet within 4 months on the job, JFK had sent another 500 Special Forces troops and military personnel overseas, and within 2 years, there were another 10,000 advisors on the way. By the time JFK was assassinated, there were roughly 16,700 U.S. advisors in the country, 16,000 more than in 1960, with the violence swiftly escalating. While the conflict in Vietnam was escalating during the year 1963, some of the most cataclysmic events of the entire war took place. That spring, CIA agent Lucien Conin had gone into South Vietnam undercover as a spy. In May, he went to the former provincial capital of Hue to see the celebrations surrounding the Buddha's 2,527th birthday. However, while the celebrations were taking place, South Vietnamese soldiers and police officers assaulted and killed several Buddhist worshippers. In protest, a Buddhist monk, Quan Duc, doused himself in gasoline and immolated his body in front of the entire world. However, South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem continued to escalate his government's war on the Buddhists, and his forces began to openly kill women and children in their pagodas. Soon, the Kennedy administration started secretly discussing plans to remove Diem from power. In late August, Kennedy approved a cable recommending action, and on the 26th, the ambassador to South Vietnam sent a return cable to Kennedy reading, "We are launched on a course from which there is no turning back, the overthrow of the Diem government."
So all we can do is help, and we're making it very clear. But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That'd be a great mistake.
Vietnamese generals assassinated Diem in early November with $40,000 in backing from the CIA. After it was done, Kennedy regretted his decision, immediately expressing dismay and disgust. However, without his support, it likely wouldn't have happened in the first place. When John Kennedy took over the presidency from Dwight Eisenhower, he initiated a major change in the CIA. It took some time because, at first, he was so upset with the agency over their handling of the Bay of Pigs crisis that he wanted nothing more to do with them. However, he soon changed his mind and started to supercharge their activities. Whereas Eisenhower's administration had launched about 170 CIA operations during his entire two-term presidency, Kennedy initiated nearly as many, 163, in less than one term. This meant the CIA was conducting operations at double the rate under Kennedy compared to Eisenhower, including the aforementioned plots against Fidel Castro. Much of this was carried out under the supervision of John McCone, who took over as the director of the CIA when Allen Dulles departed after the Bay of Pigs disaster. Initially, JFK considered putting in his brother Robert Kennedy as director, but thought better of it. According to John Prados in Save for Democracy, not only did the CIA authorize 163 missions during JFK's tenure, but they had plans approved for nearly 400 more. NSA Director McGeorge Bundy, one of Kennedy's closest colleagues, has since noted how much pressure the administration started to exert over the CIA for increased covert missions. The first 6 months of John Kennedy's presidency were about as dreadful as you can get. First, election rigging accusations clouded his victory. Then he presided over the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in April. A month and a half later, in June, at his first summit with the premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, things again went poorly. Khrushchev, who was 67 at the time and had been a Bolshevik since the Russian Revolution, did not respect the 44-year-old Kennedy or even take him seriously.
Advisors had warned him that the hot-tempered Soviet leader would use threats and intimidation to impose his will.
Khrushchev compared JFK negatively to his predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower, and considered him immature. Kennedy, eager to prove himself to the veteran hardline communist, tried to debate Khrushchev on issues like Marxism and imperialism, but it only served to prove his own ineptitude and inexperience. At one point, Kennedy even told Khrushchev he considered there to be rough parity between the Western European forces like NATO and the Sino-Soviet alliance in Asia. It shocked Kennedy's aides that he would make such an assertion, while Khrushchev was thrilled at getting an American president to admit he considered the USSR military equals. After the summit, Kennedy knew he was a beaten man. When asked about the meetings with Khrushchev, Kennedy replied, "Worst thing in my life, he savaged me." When World War II ended, one of the biggest questions for the Allies was how to administer newly occupied Germany. They decided to split the country into 4 quadrants, with the victors, the United States, France, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, each taking responsibility for one zone. The Soviets, however, wanted the other Allies to leave Berlin, which was in the Soviet sector, and tensions increased when the West balked at the idea. In November 1958, Khrushchev gave a speech demanding the Western Allies immediately leave Berlin and pull out all of their personnel and equipment within 6 months. But negotiations between Khrushchev and the Eisenhower administration broke down in 1960 when the USSR shot down an American U-2 spy plane on a reconnaissance mission over Russian territory. Khrushchev decided to wait for the next presidential administration before renewing talks. At the Vienna summit with Kennedy in 1961, the Soviet leader again gave the US 6 months to leave Berlin. Kennedy responded by sending 1,500 troops to the German capital via the Autobahn and called up 150,000 Army reservists. Then, on August 13, 1961, the East German government started to erect the now infamous Berlin Wall, separating East and West Berlin. Eventually, the wall was reinforced with concrete, and it stood as a symbol of the Cold War until its destruction in 1989. After the Berlin Wall was erected in August 1961, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union came to a serious boil. Later in the month, in response to the Kennedy administration's continued buildup of nuclear weapons, Khrushchev publicly announced the resumption of open-air nuclear weapons testing, ending a 2.5-year moratorium. They conducted almost 1 nuclear test a day for the next 2 months, including exploding the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear explosion ever recorded. That September, Kennedy responded by resuming the US's dormant nuclear testing program. Back in Berlin, the political temperature was getting even hotter. In late October, at Checkpoint Charlie, one of the authorized crossing points on the Soviet-US border in Berlin, a dispute broke out over the search of US diplomats and their travel documents. The Kennedy administration responded by mobilizing several US Army tanks to aim their guns toward the East German side. The Soviets responded by mobilizing their own tanks. Everyone was locked and loaded, waiting for things to kick off. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed. Kennedy reached out to Khrushchev through clandestine back channels, and both agreed to remove their tanks from Checkpoint Charlie, ending the threat of escalation. In August of 1962, President Kennedy's attention was focused on British Guiana, a small country in northern South America. Guyana had been under the control of Great Britain since the late 18th century and had only recently been allowed nominal independence. However, when the British allowed open elections for the first time in the 1950s, the winner, Cheta Jagan, was immediately labeled a communist and thrown in jail. He was released a year later, and in the 1961 elections, Jagan's political party won 75% of the seats in the Guyanese Assembly, and he was elected prime minister. Almost immediately, Kennedy and the director of the CIA, John McCone, started to discuss possibilities for removing Jagan from office due to his perceived communist leanings. Jagan visited the White House that October and tried to convince Washington that he wasn't aligned with the Soviet Union. However, JFK refused to listen, and instead, he initiated a $2 million program for Jagan's overthrow the following August. Throughout 1963, the CIA supported Jagan's political opponent, Forbes Burnham. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963 before there was any action. But the CIA, with British support, was able to oust Jagan from power in 1964 under JFK's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson. When JFK became president in January 1961, the issue of communism in Latin America instantly became one of his top priorities. The recent ascensions of Fidel Castro and Cheta Jagan to power in Latin American countries made it clear that communism had infiltrated the Western Hemisphere, and Kennedy was determined to stop it from spreading. As such, in mid-March 1961, Kennedy announced the creation of the Alliance for Progress in Latin America.
For no real progress is possible unless the benefits of increased prosperity are shared by the people themselves.
The purpose of the alliance was to fight against inequality and poverty in Latin America by creating programs to help reduce illiteracy and improve public health. That August, Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline traveled to Uruguay to inaugurate the Alliance for Progress in Punta del Este. Unfortunately, the alliance was hampered from the beginning. Federal funding, originally pledged at $10 billion over 10 years, was partly spent on creating paramilitary armies to fight communism, and never even came close to the levels of the Marshall Plan in Europe. Though there were some mild improvements to housing, education, and public health, overall the alliance was a disaster. Economic growth slumped below anticipated levels, unemployment increased, and no less than 6 military coups took place in Latin America during Kennedy's presidency. Rapid population growth mitigated many of the advances in poverty and public health, and most Latin American leaders feared Washington far more than they did communism. Hardly progress. While President Kennedy certainly had his hands full dealing with problems in Latin America, his policies toward Africa offered him little respite. While campaigning against Vice President Richard Nixon in 1960, Kennedy criticized the Eisenhower administration's attitude towards Africa. However, when he took over in early 1961, there was strong continuity between the two administrations' Africa policies. Kennedy was just as concerned with the rise and spread of communism in Africa as he was in Vietnam, especially after the Soviet Union started to gain a foothold in the northeast region of the African continent. Kennedy began to offer financial incentives to neutral African leaders in order to convince them to ally with the U.S. instead of the Soviet Union, but did little to champion true African nationalism and independence, and his policies in South Africa were even worse. Apartheid and segregation had been endemic in the country since the early 20th century, and in the 1950s, the racist policies were encoded into law by the Afrikaner government.
Living, doing business or owning land in white areas was banned. There were separate public facilities, transport and schools. Interracial marriage was banned.
The Kennedy administration did basically nothing to end Afrikaner rule in South Africa, engaging only in symbolic efforts to oppose the white supremacist policies of the South African government. He refused to institute economic sanctions and continued America's reliance on the country's precious minerals for trade. Kennedy did finally agree to sign an arms embargo, but at the same time he continued to sell them spare military parts, effectively and bizarrely undermining his own agreement. Another region of Africa that drew the close attention of the Kennedy administration was what was known as the Congo Crisis, which had actually begun in 1960 during the Eisenhower administration. According to the State Department's Office of the Historian, throughout 1960, the Congolese were preparing for their official independence from Belgium, something the Eisenhower team supported. But that June, a mutiny broke out, pitting Congolese and Belgium troops against each other, and soon the entire country was engulfed in chaos. In the midst of infighting in the new Congolese government, a colonel in the army, Joseph Mobutu, initiated a coup and seized power. The new Kennedy administration immediately supported Mobutu in his bid to create a stable and pro-Western Congo. They provided funds and signed bilateral military agreements. Kennedy even arranged for Mobutu to attend parachute training school at Fort Benning, Georgia, as a testament to their relationship. Mobutu, who changed the country's name from Congo to Zaire and began to call himself Mobutu Sese Seko, ruled the country for the next 3 decades until he was finally deposed in 1997. Mobutu's government was incredibly unstable, and he constantly faced rebellions and coup attempts. He is also remembered for his corruption, having amassed an enormous personal fortune while presiding over a poverty-stricken and economically stagnant nation. Yet without Kennedy's support, he might never have come to power in the 1960s. At first, it may sound surprising, but beginning with Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s all the way to Richard Nixon in the 1970s, every American president at some point allowed secret recordings of their meetings.
Lordy, I hope there are tapes.
In fact, during his time in office, John Kennedy was one of the most prolific secret tapers of all. In spring 1962, Secret Service agent Robert Bauch installed JFK's concealed recording system in both the Oval Office and the Cabinet Room. JFK died before ever having to explain the secret taping system, which was only publicly revealed in 1973 during the Watergate hearings. Kennedy's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, has suggested that it was installed for the purpose of keeping accurate records. She also claimed that Kennedy had it put in because his advisors had a tendency to agree to things in private only to publicly claim the opposite, and JFK wanted to be able to hold them accountable with their own words. Regardless of the reason, Kennedy and a few Secret Service agents were the only ones with access to the taping systems, which were controlled by concealed switches. There were microphones installed in multiple places to make sure as much was recorded as possible. In total, Kennedy racked up nearly 250 hours of taped meetings and 12 hours of recorded phone calls from spring 1962 until his death in November 1963, much of which has now been declassified. Since his assassination on November 22, 1963, JFK's legacy has repeatedly been subjected to sensationalized rumors about his private life. The most notorious among these are his alleged extramarital relationships with a number of women. JFK is suspected of being involved in at least 6 clandestine affairs. Several of the women were supposedly members of the White House staff, including interns and secretaries, and many of the women have claimed the relationships started in the late 1950s or 1960s, when Kennedy would have been either a senator or president. Unfortunately, there isn't a ton of evidence to support whether or not most or any of those affairs ever actually happened. JFK was never given an opportunity to confront his accusers before his death. However, several Kennedy aides, like Barbara Gamarakian, have confirmed some of the stories about his infidelity.
Where sex was concerned, John F. Kennedy thought he was untouchable, invulnerable.
The most famous accusation revolves around an alleged affair he had with actor and superstar Marilyn Monroe. There is some speculation that his wife Jackie knew about the affairs but tolerated them. Unfortunately, it's likely we'll never know the complete truth about Kennedy's private life. Another area of John Kennedy's private life that is rife with speculation is his and his family's alleged ties to mob figures like Sam Giancana and the Chicago Outfit. The rumors go back to the 1960 presidential election and the accusations of ballot stuffing and voter fraud. There have long been allegations that Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy, contacted Giancana to have the Chicago mob rig the election in his son's favor, in exchange for not prosecuting their various crimes once JFK took office. There are also allegations that Frank Sinatra contacted Giancana on behalf of Joe Kennedy to ask the mobster to flip the election for his son. However, there is no evidence to support any of these allegations. The biggest accusations connecting Kennedy to the mob were made by Judith Campbell Exner in her memoirs. Exner wrote that she had affairs with both Giancana and Kennedy, and that she tried to introduce them to each other in 1960 to help fix the election. However, her stories at times contradict each other and were vehemently denied by Kennedy's closest aides. It is true that Kennedy's CIA and Giancana were working together to assassinate Cuban President Fidel Castro, but that wasn't personally arranged by Kennedy himself, but rather by CIA agents Richard Helms and William Harvey, though Kennedy may have been aware of the scheme through his brother, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy.